Greetings, diners and Collapse Cafe fans. Welcome to another edition of the Collapse Cafe here on the Doomstead Diner. Today, you can see that it's not one of our big vidcasts with tons and tons of people. I'm talking with a new diner cross-posting blogger. She goes by the handle of Phoenixor. And she is from Sweden, and her real name is Linda Bergqvist. I'm trying to pronounce that correctly, but I'm sure I'm getting it a little bit off. And she runs a blog, Peak Resources, on Blogspot, which she just turned me on to recently. She joined our diner crew of chatters, debaters, and arguers on our forum a little while back, and has put up some very interesting comments in that forum, and she brings a new voice to the diner. She's our first active Swedish member. We have members from Australia and from England and Italy and so forth, and we do have Swedish readers, I know, based on page hits and all that good stuff. But our first active person to talk to from Sweden. So I was really interested in talking with Linda and taking this opportunity to do it. I'll let Linda tell you a little bit about her background in resilience science and her education and so forth to kick it off. Linda, you want to tell the gang about what you studied and how this brings you to collapse issues?
Sure. I studied social ecological resilience, it's called. So it's basically like sustainable development, but it's focused on systems ecology. So it's more about system dynamics than anything else, basically. So it could be, studying fisheries collapse, or studying small-scale farming in Africa and problems with that. Or it could be like urban development and problems with that, basically. So it's everything that is a system, and everything is a system. So you can study that. And that's what we did. And I was doing a thesis work on financial markets linked to ecosystems and ecosystem services, which is basically it's not done yet. Like, no one knows how it works. Like, what is the connection between the financial sphere, the commodity, the actual commodity market and the commodities, and its impact on ecosystems. So I was trying to do that, but it was really, really difficult to do anything about that. And when I started reading up on how the financial markets work, then I realized how bad the situation is, like, internationally. You have one idea of the markets work this way, and there's a theory for that and whatever. I hadn't really studied a lot of economics before, but then I just realized that all these theories are wrong, basically. And so that was kind of a turning point for me, I think.
About how long ago did that turning point come for you? A year, 2 years, 3 years ago?
Basically, maybe, 2 years ago. So it's not that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a bit of a problem with, even most of the people that I know that I studied with, they don't know anything about, like, the markets or whatever, like other areas of interest. They know a lot about like ecology, but they don't understand the link between what people do, what people do in the international sphere, how that influences the resource flow, basically.
Absolutely. The money, the understanding of the way money controls basically all the utilization of resources, and how that is then controlled by very large financial institutions is one of those issues that I think even uh, most people, even in the financial world, don't understand it, and
Yeah.
that is a very sad situation
Yeah.
indeed. Okay, so you came to that realization, and then what uh, what did you do from there? What have you tried to uh, accomplish since then, since grasping onto that fact of life?
Uh, well, I mean, accomplished. I've started writing blogs. Basically, is what I've done, and I went through depression, so that was not the best kind of way of handling the situation, I guess. But and I moved from Stock. I used to live in Stockholm, in the really central part of Stockholm, and so I got really, because I learned about the energy part, also the energy connection, which most environmental scientists don't even understand. So I saw the need for change, and I knew it was going to happen. And so I basically wanted my then boyfriend to understand this, and that we would do something together, but he did not understand it. And so it ended up with me basically moving away from Stockholm, and that kind of hipster, very shallow kind of lifestyle, and moving to a smaller city in Sweden, where my
Well,
family is from.
that is that's a very interesting personal story, actually. Take us off on a little tangent there. Uh, One of the conversations we've had with Norman Paget recently, and also with Jason Heppenstall as a couple of kids, is how the knowledge of these type of changes affect uh, personal relationships and so forth. So I gather from what you just said that that this epiphany that you had uh, caused a breakup with your old boyfriend.
Yeah, basically. I mean, there were other things, of course. It's not that simple, but basically, I didn't want to live that kind of lifestyle any longer inside like a tiny apartment in, just around concrete, and, focusing on just how much money you're gonna make and stuff like this, the ordinary lifestyle. And also, I think it's really difficult to kind of share your opinion without people saying, you're just negative, like yeah, okay, so the facts are like this, but you have a negative outlook, therefore there's something wrong with you, basically. Like, they cannot separate, if even if you have evidence or facts about something, they cannot separate this from having a negative or positive outlook on things. And so
Well, one of the things we talked about in an earlier conversation is you know, the general Swedish or Scandinavian attitude towards, conversing on some deeper subjects and so forth, and the difficulty of communicating with others on those
mm,
levels in Sweden. You want to pick up a little bit on that issue?
yeah, I mean, what people have to understand is that basically it's a very small country. It's huge in landmass, but it's only 9 million people. So it's very, and it's people are spread out a lot. So it's very kind of it's like Japan a bit. The norms and the rules are very, like, maybe they're not like written out loud, but they're very real. People have to, behave in a certain way. So the pressure is always on not to go too far out from the standard, personal life or whatever. So people are very like they're very uncertain about, they're not like Americans, like, oh fuck, I'm gonna do whatever I want, whatever. Swedish people are much more like, oh, what is my neighbor doing, okay, so I have to do the same, and like, so if you are different in some way, just the fact that I've lived outside of Sweden for a long time before as well, people don't, it's very difficult not to revert to normalizing again when you come back to Sweden, because the pressure is always on, you know.
It's a conformist culture,
Yeah.
basically. Well, I mean, you talk about in America, people do whatever the fuck they want and so forth. But there's what we call here in America the keeping up with the Joneses
Yeah,
idea,
sure.
and that's if your neighbor buys a bigger, better car, then you've got to buy a bigger, better car, or else you're not good enough in the culture. And our culture is highly consumptive as a result. It's all about how much money you make and buying the bigger and better cars, bigger and better McMansions, and so forth.
Yeah.
And so that drives the society on a sort of an undercurrent, and the undercurrent is financial here as opposed to maybe a cultural, as it is in Sweden. But it ends up in kind of the same way in the end. Uh, so you moved out of Stockholm Central and out to a further out location. Is it a rural type location with farms? Is it a semi-urban location? How would you describe the type of area you're in?
Right now I'm in outside of Linköping, which is basically the fifth biggest city. Doesn't say a lot, but it's 2 hours south of Stockholm. And then I live 1 hour north of that. And this it's kind of a small suburb, but there are farms. It's a heavy, it's an agricultural area. So it's like 5,000 people who lives here. And so it's very small. And
Mhm.
it's centered around basically, yeah, there's a school and there's one shop, and then there's a lot of farms. So that's
So
basically how it looks.
do you have opportunity on those farms to practice any sustainable agriculture techniques or permaculture or whatever?
Not in that sense. I mean, one problem with Sweden, like we might be talking about later, but one problem is that there are very few farms in the sense of who owns them. Like there's not a lot of small ownership farms. The big part, they're big farms, or like one person owns them, and mostly it's like with tractors and heavy machinery and stuff like that. So
Industrial agriculture.
yeah, but I have seen there is a trend right now towards people actually moving out toward in the countryside again, and like making their own bread, keeping chickens and stuff like that. So I think there is a trend, but it's not in specifically in this area where I live, but maybe like 1 hour south, I think, maybe.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
Same thing here in our country. It's mostly industrial agriculture, but there's a small movement of people who are trying to get other things going, and
yeah,
on a smaller scale,
yeah.
and so forth, and talk about
It's also
relocalization.
difficult because it gets really cold in Sweden. So you can't just, like you need greenhouses in that case. You can't just like grow whatever outside.
Hmm. Yeah, well, one of our enthusiasms on the diner is developing grow houses and hydroponics as opposed to some traditional forms of agriculture, in the sense that are more applicable to climates that are sometimes harsh, and just the fact that we know that. Um, climate is changing, and so
Yeah.
one has to adapt to that. With that in mind, one of the blogs that you wrote, the most recent one, I think it was, and it'll be going up on the diner along with this broadcast, was on the food situation in Sweden, and where you see that going, and the possibilities that famine at some point could come to Sweden. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue that, like, basically our politicians are saying, no, no, it's not a problem, you know. Like most countries, if you compare Sweden to Finland, for example, they have a self-sufficiency policy since they were occupied during the Second World War. So they promote their own internal production of grains and milk and stuff like that, just because they don't want to be import dependent, right?
So,
Um,
I'm sorry, was that Denmark you were talking about?
Finland.
Finland. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, but in Sweden, we don't have this. Instead, our politicians are basically following the European agricultural policy that says, you know, you have to be competitive. You're not allowed to promote your own internal businesses, blah blah blah. Which of course is bullshit, because every country in Europe does this. Like, just look at France; they have so many subsidies for their own farmers. But so as a result, we import 50% of all the food we consume in Sweden, even though we have a lot of land, and even old farming land that now is just like, like
Laying fallow is what it's.
exactly, laying fallow. So it's not being used or anything. Um, so and therefore we also import oil. We import, like, I think it's 30% of our energy use basically, and 50% of that comes from Russia. And some estimation is that, like, if let's say that there is no like major conflict or crisis before uh, uh, 2030, then basically by 2030 almost all of the exporting oil will be gone. Like, Norway doesn't have a lot left, Denmark doesn't have a lot left, so it's basically just Russia, and I think we import some from Nigeria. But I mean, it's not the countries you want to be dependent on, you know. Like, it's a very bad strategy. And
Well, we're dependent on the Saudi oil, and
yeah,
that isn't too great a country to be depending on these days either. So,
no, yeah, I
basically,
think most of the oil countries are probably like that now. I'm not sure, but yeah. But in any case, we have. It's not a problem about electricity here, because we have our hydro and we have our nuclear. But we use oil and diesel 90% for the transport sector. So we have some biofuels, but as most people probably know, it's not very efficient, and you need to grow a lot just to have, to be able to drive your car or whatever. But
sure.
there have been tries to use biofuels for tractors and stuff like that. So that is actually possible, but I mean, it would still take more than, people estimate that we should be fossil free, have a fossil free transportation sector by 2030, I think the government has said. But that's not possible basically. There's
Well,
no incentives for it, and yeah, I think, like, it's just very unrealistic.
well, that's goes, the whole transportation system. I mean, one thing that you have an advantage there is that there aren't as many people, uh,
Yeah,
so you have a smaller group to work with, um, but still making that conversion. What about EVs, electric vehicles? Is there much of a push to get those on the road in Sweden? Are they popular amongst people to buy and so forth yet?
I would say it's mostly like a media hype. Like people just love tech solutions, you know. And in Norway, they have a lot of subsidies for having electric cars. So you have a lot of rich Norwegians going around in Teslas, but like they're still too expensive for ordinary Swede to really buy them. And also, it's very problematic because it is a very it's not a very densely populated country. So where are you going to put the chargers, and how, like, the charging of batteries is not efficient enough. So it might take you like 1 day just to charge the battery when you're trying to go somewhere. So there's a lot of issues there. I mean, people do want this kind of development, but I just see it more as a dream solution than it is actually on its way, you know, like that it's not really being practiced. Or I think it might like be, let's be like let's say it's 1%. 1% of all cars is electric. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah, I think that's the case here as well, and it is a kind of a plaything or a toy for the well-to-do. The prices on the cars, the electric
yeah.
cars, are such. I know uh, um, Elon Musk recently introduced an electric SUV that sells in the six figures. I think it's something like $120,000 or something like that for that vehicle. And the number of people that can afford to drop that chunk of change on a car is pretty small. So that conversion to electric vehicles to me also seems like a non-starter. Um,
Yeah.
so you've got the food issue, and then you've got the energy issue. You mentioned that um, Sweden does have a good amount of hydropower. You also mentioned, though, the that you have nuclear plants. Do you know how many nuclear plants there are, how they're sprinkled around, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about the actual number now because I think they're closing two of the reactors. And so we have in Oskarshamn, which is like in the southwest, along the coast, basically. We have or have had at least four or something like that, I think. And then we have two, three more somewhere else. I'm not too certain about how many reactors there actually are, but I know that they're getting old now. So now is actually, or maybe even last year, was one inflection point where the government had to decide: are we continuing? Like, should we upgrade our nuclear power plants, or should we just decommission them? And the problem with the government right now is that
Well,
no
it's a
one.
big question.
Mm,
One thing that's going on here is our connection. I think is right. You want to? I don't know if it'll come back or not, but we do have a big anti-nuclear movement, and there's a lot of concern in the blogosphere, in the collapsed blogosphere, that as the fossil fuel economy winds down, that we'll start getting more meltdowns from the nuclear plants and the cooling ponds and all that. Is there any kind of anti-nuclear movement going on in Sweden?
sure. There has been a big movement since the 70s, basically, when that movement kind of started, you know, like anti-nuclear. I have a bit of a issue with this oversimplification of like nuclear is always bad, because if you look at Sweden, the electricity from the nuclear plants is also the reason why we don't emit as much CO2. So, you know, you can choose then. Either you say basically, okay, we don't want nuclear because we're afraid we might die, or there might be some problem in the future. Or you can say, okay, we want nuclear because we actually want to lower our emissions. But you can only choose between those options, right? So I mean, it's a little bit oversimplification, but I think it's not as simple as some people pay, like, you know, there's also big difference between how Japan has their nuclear power plants in the middle of the most geological active area in the world, and in Sweden where we don't have that, like never any major natural catastrophes. Basically, we might have some flooding issues, but that's it. So, I mean, I think it's a bit of I don't really like when environmentalists say that they're pro, you know, saving the environment or whatever, and then they say, but no, no nuclear. So we're just gonna live on, you know, solar power. But that's, you know, it's totally
Well,
unrealistic.
you know, especially in Sweden, where, as you mentioned, you're so far north that you know, in the wintertime, the amount of sunlight that you get is fairly small, and so, you know, and plus there's all the power problems with intermittency of
Yeah.
the stuff. Solar, you know, goes off at night. You know, you're not charging and so forth. So, you know, load balancing is an issue. I think you know, the issue with nuclear, though, that it concerns people the most is the spent fuel, and
Yeah.
the fact that there's no real good disposal methods for the spent fuel. And
Mm,
that it's, you know, distributed around all over the place, and that some of
yeah.
those radionucleotides will last, you know, thousands of years. And,
Yeah.
you know, are we
No, I mean,
people going to maintain them?
I totally understand that. And one thing that I read up on this a bit because I wanted to know more, because most people actually don't know that much. And we have some nuclear physicists basically, and they're moving away from Sweden now because they were not allowed to do active research for like 30 years because the government banned research on it. Because of
Mhm.
this, the movement in the 1970s, it was not allowed to do research, right? So that's a very kind of Soviet style, you know, you're not allowed to think about certain things. Anyway, um, but there are like there. I mean, you could make fuel of what is now waste. It would be possible, but you would need to do like generation 5. You would need to do a demonstration of it, and it would cost, in Swedish crowns, it would cost like I think uh, at least a couple of million or maybe 1 billion to build that kind of demonstration plant.
Mhm.
So you would just, you, instead of burying something in the ground that it will be there for 100,000 years, you take that up, you use it again, and then it's 1,000 years. So that's possible.
Yeah, basically, changing the uh, types of atoms that are uh, that are there by bombarding them with neutrons and so forth, and whatnot. And there are means and methods of making those changes. Um, but as of yet, and whether it's in Sweden or here in the fascist states of America or in Japan, uh, nobody has, as of yet, demonstrated what you would call a clean nuclear system that takes care of its waste. Uh, we have spent fuel ponds here by the you know, truckload.
Yeah.
So
No, I mean,
it's a
I don't
concern.
want to. I don't want to seem like a fanatic that's like, oh, nuclear. I'm just saying that it's not always that simple. That because I think people are really frightened about when there is a catastrophe like Fukushima. And of course I understand that. But do you know how many people die from just burning coal every day or every year? Like it's much more. It's more people die from that. So you have to be kind of honest about numbers also.
Right. Well, and just the fact that the ecosphere as a whole is changing rapidly, and so you're seeing all these effects, algae blooms and fish die-offs, and other things that are wrecking uh, the system. So it's hard to know where what you should worry about first
Yeah.
on these things, and you kind of have to triage it and prioritize it in your head. And just let's move on to one more topic
Mm,
today, which would be the politics and political situation going on in Sweden. We've seen in the news that there are a lot of refugees wanting to migrate to Sweden. Sweden and Germany seemingly the most popular destinations for the people leaving the war zones down in the Middle East. How has that been affecting Sweden and the politics there and whatnot? What do you see happening?
well, it it's become a major issue now, especially since Sweden has a very like generous immigration policy. Basically, we take a lot. We take most immigrants per like how many people live in Sweden, and we take more than Germany if you compare per capita,
By
basically.
percentage. By percentage.
Yeah.
Right.
So of course, and we have the Sweden Democrats, which is now I think in opinion polls shows that they might even be the biggest party next election, because people are tired of like irresponsible immigration policy or whatever you would call it. And now today I read the headline saying that the government had a press conference stating that like we have a crisis, we have a major crisis, we have so many immigrants coming in that now we're gonna put up tents somewhere and put them in tents. And it's October here, so it's like, I mean, it's not that cold, but it's 10 degrees. And so we're somehow gonna put plenty of Syrians, and if there are other people as well, in tents somewhere. Or even they discussed about evacuating prisons and putting the immigrants in the prisons, and the prisoners I don't know where. So it's like a clown government, and this is exactly why they're gonna lose to xenophobic parties later on, I think, because they don't know what to do about the situation, and also because the previous government had the policy of economic growth by increasing the population, basically by taking in more immigrants. So and people are not stupid. They understand that like people are, not everyone is like xenophobic. They just want responsible policies. But then there comes this one party that basically has its roots in a kind of Nazi background, and they say all these things that ordinary people are thinking, only that their motivation for doing it's different. But people don't separate that. They don't separate the policy from oh, that's something I've been thinking about, I think that too, blah blah blah. So people are very easily persuaded, and they think, a lot of people I think also don't trust the media any longer, because they never report on the critical numbers on immigration, or like certain news they don't report on. So people become very anti-science, anti-media, anti and turn to the Sweden Democrats instead.
Mhm. Well, what about the cultural differences between the immigrants and the local Swedish population? Of course, you have the you know, Sweden is primarily a Protestant country, Christian Protestants mostly, and most of the immigrants are Muslims. So you have that religious difference, and then on top of that, you have a lot of cultural differences in terms of dress. I read somewhere that Swedish girls were being encouraged not to wear short dresses because that doesn't play well with the Muslim community and so forth. Have you seen much of a cultural battle go on with the immigrants?
Yeah, of course, there are plenty of these discussions. I mean, I would say that 40% maybe are say they're Protestants, but most people are not religious at all in Sweden. They don't go to church, nothing like that. I mean, you have to be when you're born, basically, you're put into the register of the church just because you might have been baptized or something. But no one really goes to church or is very religious. So that's number one. We have seen attacks on mosques lately. So that is one conflict. I think we have a population that is maybe 2% Muslim. And then in Malmö in the south, we have had attacks on Jewish communities. Nothing as major as in the rest of Europe, like shootings and stuff like that. But vandalism, basically, or like burning down houses and stuff like that. So there is a tension, but I would say in that case, it's mostly from the kind of Nazi fascist white supremacist groupings that are fed up with immigrants. On the other hand, we have the cultural problem or differences that we have had. Domestic violence, for example, is a problem with the immigration communities. You're not allowed to just beat your wife or your daughter, but in these communities that happens much more often than in the pure Swedish communities. So that is a cultural difference. And I think the Swedish people, I mean, maybe not the people, but in the media, they're so PC. They're so worried about stepping the bounds, So they're like, hey, we have to. It's this. I call it relativism. It's always the justification of a minority, because they're scared of, making people angry at the minority, basically, even though people in that minority actually are breaking the law, or for example, that it somehow would be okay to hit women if you're from a Muslim country, like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely a huge cultural difference, and I guess basically in the West, and we talk about this on the diner from time to time. Um, we gathered a mem of equality for men and women, and a equal opportunity in the workplace and so forth. Not that it's been achieved 100%, but that has been the the political style and the social mem that has grown up, basically, I guess, here since women's suffrage. Um, but that type of attitude really hasn't happened down in the Middle East. It's still very much a patriarchal or male dominated culture, and so the way in which women are viewed is substantially different. um,
Mm.
and with that in mind, it is really good to have a female voice on the diner. We have too few of those. And also someone from your demographic is, you see things in a whole different light than the older folks do. So that contrast of generational opinions, I think, is a very important aspect of it. So, Linda or Phoenixor, welcome to the Diner Pantheon of cross-posting bloggers. We look forward to reading your blogs, and also we are hoping to get together a pan-European Collapse Cafe in November sometime. So hopefully you can join us from Sweden then as well. And that's all the doom. This time until next time, here on the Collapse Cafe. See you later, diners.